When most people think of Versailles, they think of excess. Gold-leafed halls, endless mirrors, manicured gardens stretched into mathematical perfection. A palace so extravagant that it has become shorthand for royal arrogance, decadence, and eventual collapse. In popular memory, Versailles is treated as a monument to vanity, a beautiful mistake that drained France's treasury and symbolized everything that went wrong with absolute monarchy. But this interpretation misses the deeper logic behind why Versailles was built in the first place. Versailles was not designed merely to impress. It was designed to control, not only socially and politically, but economically. Long before it became a cautionary tale, Versailles functioned as a carefully engineered financial instrument, one meant to reorganize capital, redirect elite behavior, and centralize economic power around the crown. To understand Versailles only as a palace is to misunderstand its purpose. It was, in effect, a financial weapon disguised as architecture. In 17th-century France, the monarchy did not suffer from a lack of authority on paper. The king was absolute in theory, but in practice, real power was fragmented. Wealth was decentralized. Noble families controlled land, private armies, tax privileges, and local economies. The crown's greatest threat was not rebellion from below, but autonomy at the top. Money, not loyalty, was the true source of that autonomy. Versailles was built to solve this problem. By drawing the nobility into a single physical space, the crown was not just hosting them. It was restructuring their incentives. Every room, every ceremony, every architectural decision was calibrated to alter how elites spent their time, their money, and ultimately, their political leverage. The palace did not simply consume wealth. It absorbed it, redirected it, and neutralized it. From the outside, Versailles looks like an expense. From the inside, it functioned as a system that transformed independent aristocrats into dependent courtiers. A system that converted private wealth into visible loyalty. A system that made proximity to the king more valuable than control over land or armies. This is where the hidden economics begin. Versailles created a new market, one where status replaced productivity and access replaced ownership. Nobles were encouraged, even pressured, to spend enormous sums maintaining appearances at court. Lavish clothing, servants, residences near the palace, gifts, and ceremonial obligations were not optional. They were the cost of participation. And participation was everything. By concentrating the elite at Versailles, the crown weakened their local economic bases. Absentee landlords lost touch with their regions. Independent power networks atrophied. Capital that once reinforced regional autonomy was now consumed in a centralized system that offered prestige instead of leverage. This was not accidental overspending. It was economic strategy. The palace also functioned as a signaling device. To foreign powers, Versailles projected unmatched wealth and stability. To domestic financiers, it implied permanence. To tax collectors and administrators, it reinforced hierarchy. The physical scale of the palace was a message. This system is too large, too entrenched to challenge. At the same time, Versailles allowed the monarchy to monitor elites continuously. Financial dependence is more effective when combined with surveillance. Who attended which events? Who spent lavishly? Who fell into debt? Who received favors? All of this information flowed through the palace. Economic vulnerability became a lever of control. Importantly, Versailles did not need to generate revenue directly. Its value lay in how it reorganized existing wealth. It redirected surplus away from independent accumulation and toward consumption that benefited the crown's position. In doing so, it transformed money into obedience. This is why calling Versailles a waste misses the point. Waste implies inefficiency. Versailles was brutally efficient at what it was designed to do. It neutralized the economic power of the nobility without open conflict. It replaced feudal fragmentation with centralized dependence. It turned personal wealth into a liability unless it was spent in alignment with royal priorities. Only much later, when the broader economic environment shifted, did the system begin to show strain. But at its core, Versailles was never just a palace. It was an economic architecture of power. And once you see it that way, the story of Versailles stops being about extravagance and starts being about design. If this way of looking at famous places feels different, you may want to follow this channel for deeper economic breakdowns like this. Before this video, had you ever thought about this place as a financial system rather than a landmark? To understand why Versailles could exist at all, we need to step into the economic reality of 17th-century France, a world where wealth was not primarily generated through industry or innovation, but through land, privilege, and control over taxation. This was an economy defined by extraction rather than productivity, where power flowed not from markets, but from who was allowed to collect, keep, or avoid paying money. France was rich on paper. It possessed vast agricultural lands, a large population, and expanding trade routes. Yet the crown itself was chronically short of cash. The contradiction lay in the structure of the system. Wealth was widely dispersed among noble families, regional authorities, and tax farmers, while the monarchy carried the burden of war, administration, and state legitimacy. The king ruled absolutely in theory, but economically, his position was fragile. Royal revenue depended heavily on indirect taxes and borrowing. Collection was inefficient, fragmented, and often outsourced to private intermediaries who kept large shares for themselves. Large segments of the nobility were exempt from taxation entirely. This meant that the crown faced rising expenses without a corresponding increase in reliable income. This imbalance created a structural problem. The monarchy needed to assert control over wealth without triggering rebellion. It needed to centralize authority without directly confiscating assets. And it needed to do so in a way that appeared natural, even desirable, to those whose power it intended to weaken. Versailles emerged from this tension. The opportunity arose during a period of consolidation under Louis XIV, whose reign coincided with a broader shift toward administrative centralization. The monarchy was expanding its bureaucratic reach, professionalizing governance, and redefining loyalty as proximity to the crown rather than independence from it. At the same time, the French economy was being reshaped by mercantilist thinking. Wealth was increasingly understood as something that could be directed, managed, and displayed by the state. Economic strength was tied to visible power, order, and control. In this worldview, spectacle was not superficial. It was functional. Versailles addressed a financial problem disguised as a social one. The nobility possessed capital, land, and influence, but they were scattered across the country, reinforcing regional autonomy. Their wealth supported local economies and private networks that operated largely outside royal oversight. This decentralization limited the crown's ability to mobilize resources efficiently. The solution was not to strip nobles of their wealth outright, but to change how that wealth was used. By creating a centralized court culture that demanded constant presence, elaborate spending, and ceremonial participation, the monarchy created a new economic gravity. Capital that once reinforced independent power bases was drawn toward a single location. The more a noble invested in life at Versailles, the less they could invest elsewhere. This redirection solved multiple problems. At once, it weakened regional power centers. It increased the crown's visibility and legitimacy. And it converted private wealth into public dependence. Crucially, Versailles was possible because enough surplus already existed within the elite class. The palace did not create wealth, it harvested it. It relied on an economy where nobles could afford to spend lavishly, at least for a time, without immediate collapse. That surplus was the raw material the system consumed. The timing also mattered. France was engaged in frequent wars and diplomatic competition, displaying overwhelming Wealth served as a strategic signal to rivals. Versailles functioned as proof of capacity, even if that capacity was under strain. In international finance, perception often matters as much as reality. Capital flowed toward Versailles because it offered something no other place could: access. Access to favor, influence, offices, pensions, and protection. In an economy where privilege determined opportunity, proximity to the king became the most valuable asset of all. This is the core of the money setup. Versailles was built at the intersection of surplus wealth, fiscal weakness, and political ambition. It addressed the crown's financial problem not by increasing revenue directly, but by restructuring how existing wealth behaved. Seen in this light, the palace was not an indulgence made possible by prosperity. It was a calculated response to economic vulnerability. If understanding the economic context behind famous places matters to you, subscribing helps you stay connected to future analyses. Do you see similarities between this economic moment and conditions shaping major projects today? The official narrative surrounding Versailles presents it as a royal project funded by the state, commissioned by the king, and executed in the name of national glory. In this version of the story, the palace appears as a centralized expenditure, paid for by royal coffers and justified by sovereign authority. While this narrative is convenient, it obscures the far more distributed and strategic reality of how Versailles was actually financed. Versailles was not paid for by a single source. It was funded through a layered system of extraction, redirection, and expectation that reached deep into French society, particularly into the wealth of those who would later be most constrained by its existence. At the most visible level, state funds were indeed used. Royal revenues, already stretched thin by war and administration, were allocated to construction, maintenance, and expansion. But these revenues themselves came from a fragmented tax system that relied heavily on the peasantry and urban classes rather than the nobility. In effect, those with the least political power carried a disproportionate share of the immediate financial burden. Yet this was only the surface layer. A significant portion of Versailles' real funding came indirectly from the nobility itself. Courtiers were expected to finance their own presence at court. Housing near the palace, extravagant clothing, servants, gifts, entertainment, and ceremonial participation were not reimbursed. These expenses were understood as necessary investments in status and access. Over time, this expectation became systemic. To remain relevant, nobles had to spend. To spend, they often borrowed. To borrow, they relied on financiers closely tied to the crown. Debt became a mechanism of control, binding private wealth to royal favor. This was a crucial distinction between the public narrative and the financial reality. Officially, Versailles was a gift from the king to the nation. In practice, it functioned as a mechanism through which elite wealth was steadily absorbed into a centralized consumption system. Another often overlooked funding source was labor. Construction relied on a vast workforce drawn from across the kingdom. Wages were low, conditions were harsh, and labor was frequently coerced through obligations rather than freely negotiated contracts. The human cost of building Versailles rarely appears in financial accounts, yet it represented a massive transfer of value from workers to the state. Suppliers formed another indirect funding layer. Stonecutters, artisans, textile producers, and food suppliers operated under contracts that favored royal terms. Payments were delayed. Prices were fixed. In exchange, suppliers gained prestige and the possibility of future commissions. Like the nobles, they accepted short-term financial strain for long-term positioning within the royal economy. What do these funders expect in return? For the peasantry and urban taxpayers, the expectation was stability. Heavy taxation was tolerated because the alternative was perceived chaos. For suppliers, the return was continuity. Royal contracts promised ongoing demand in an uncertain economy. For financiers, lending to those tied to Versailles offered influence and leverage rather than simple interest. For the nobility, the return was access. Versailles transformed access into currency. Being seen, being included, being favored carried tangible economic value. Offices, pensions, tax exemptions, and marriage alliances all flowed through proximity to the court. These benefits were unevenly distributed, but their possibility kept the system functioning. This is where the genius of Versailles becomes clear. It did not confiscate wealth. It invited it in, wrapped in ceremony and obligation, and ensured that once inside, it could not easily escape. The financial system behind Versailles depended on belief. Belief that proximity would be rewarded. Belief that spending signaled loyalty. Belief that exclusion was worse than debt. As long as enough participants believed this, the system sustained itself. From a distance, it looked like royal extravagance. From within, it felt like economic necessity. This is the hidden exchange at the heart of Versailles. Money was not simply spent on stone and gold. It was converted into dependence. And dependence, far more than direct taxation, secured the crown's position. This is the part of history that often stays hidden. If you value this level of analysis, staying subscribed helps support more work like this. In your view, is influence sometimes more valuable than direct financial profit? Once Versailles was fully operational, it ceased to be a construction project and became something far more consequential, a living financial engine. Not an engine that produced goods or exported commodities, but one that processed wealth, converted it into dependence, and redistributed influence according to rules set by the crown. Its efficiency lay not in balance sheets, but in behavior modification at scale. At the center of this engine was routine. Versailles worked because it transformed exceptional power into daily habit. Every morning ritual, every meal, every audience, every procession created predictable patterns of spending and attention. Nobles were not summoned. Occasionally, they were expected to remain present. Presence required residence. Residence required expenditure. Expenditure required income or credit. Credit required favor. Money flowed through Versailles not as a single stream, but as thousands of small, continuous currents that reinforced one another. Consider court life itself. Nobles paid to maintain elaborate wardrobes that changed with fashion and ceremony. They employed staffs of servants who needed housing, food, and wages. They hosted private gatherings to maintain visibility. None of this spending was optional. To economize was to signal decline. To withdraw was to risk invisibility. This created a powerful incentive structure. Wealth that might have been invested in land improvement, local industry, or independent patronage was instead consumed in activities that produced no lasting asset outside the court. The engine was designed to favor circulation over accumulation. Pensions and offices formed another critical channel. The crown distributed stipends, sinecures, and ceremonial positions that provided income without productive output. These payments did not replace noble wealth. They supplemented it conditionally. Lose favor, and income disappeared. Retain favor, and dependence deepened. From the crown's perspective, this was extraordinarily efficient. Rather than enforcing control through force, it purchased compliance incrementally. Each pension was cheaper than a rebellion. Each office holder became invested in the system's survival. Suppliers were integrated into this engine as well. Versailles required vast quantities of food, textiles, furniture, art, and maintenance. Contracts were issued repeatedly, often to the same networks of producers. Payment delays were common, effectively turning suppliers into involuntary creditors of the state. In return, they gained prestige and continued access to royal demand. Diplomacy added another layer. Foreign envoys were received in spaces designed to overwhelm. The Hall of Mirrors was not decoration. It was economic theater. Displays of abundance shaped negotiations by signaling capacity. Even when the treasury was strained, the appearance of limitless resources altered counterpart expectations. Importantly, Versailles did not need to be financially balanced to be effective. Its purpose was not sustainability in isolation, but dominance within a broader system. As long as the crown could continue extracting value from elsewhere, the engine ran. The system scaled because it standardized behavior. Thousands of nobles, each pursuing personal advantage, collectively reinforced centralization. No single participant controlled the outcome, yet all contributed to it. This is the hallmark of a successful financial engine: alignment without coordination. Versailles also generated information. The court was a surveillance environment. Spending patterns, debts, alliances, and rivalries were visible. Financial vulnerability became legible. Those in debt were more pliable. Those seeking relief were more loyal. Money was not just flowing, it was being observed. The efficiency of the system lay in how little resistance it encountered. Nobles competed to participate. Suppliers competed to serve. Financiers competed to lend. Each actor believed they could extract advantage, even as the structure ensured that advantage remained conditional. This engine converted status into a consumable good. It transformed time, money, and attention into instruments of control. And for decades, it worked with remarkable precision. But no engine runs without friction. As Versailles expanded, the volume of resources required to keep it operating increased. What had once been a redistribution of surplus began to demand more than surplus alone could provide. The very mechanisms that made the system efficient also made it fragile when conditions changed. If deep system-level explanations like this are useful to you, subscribing helps ensure more analyses at this depth. Do you recognize similar financial engines operating quietly in modern places today? The same mechanisms that made Versailles effective as a financial weapon also ensured that it would become increasingly expensive to sustain. Power, once centralized and ritualized, does not remain static. It demands reinforcement, and reinforcement, over time, turns into obligation. By the early 18th century, Versailles was no longer a tool deployed against a fragmented nobility. It had become the environment in which power itself was expected to operate. This shift fundamentally altered its cost structure. Maintenance was no longer episodic. It was permanent. The physical palace required constant labor. Gardens designed to symbolize order and control demanded endless upkeep. Water systems, fountains, interiors, and outbuildings consumed manpower and materials year-round. These were not discretionary expenses. Allowing decay would signal weakness, and weakness carried economic consequences far beyond aesthetics. But the most significant costs were not architectural. They were structural. Court life had expanded far beyond its original scale. More nobles sought access. More offices were created to satisfy demand. More pensions were issued to maintain loyalty. Each addition raised the baseline cost of the system. What began as a selective mechanism became an all-consuming one. This expansion introduced inefficiencies. As the number of dependents grew, the crown's ability to reward loyalty meaningfully declined. Scarcity of favor led to intensified competition, increased spending, and deeper debt among courtiers. The system continued to extract wealth, but it produced diminishing returns in control. At the same time, external pressures mounted. Wars grew more expensive. State administration expanded. Debt servicing absorbed a growing share of revenue. The resources required to sustain Versailles increasingly competed with the resources required to sustain the state itself. Crucially, the system had limited flexibility. Reducing court expenditures risked alienating the very elites whose compliance it depended on. Cutting pensions or offices threatened stability. Even modest reforms carried disproportionate political cost. This created a trap. The crown was locked into maintaining a system whose original purpose had been fulfilled, but whose ongoing demands kept rising. Capital drain became normalized. Borrowing filled the gaps. Financial strain was deferred rather than resolved. The costs also became less visible to those bearing them. Much of the burden fell indirectly on taxpayers, laborers, and creditors rather than on courtiers themselves. This diffusion delayed resistance, but amplified long-term imbalance. From an economic perspective, Versailles had transitioned from an instrument of control into a fixed cost of power. It no longer reshaped incentives as effectively as before, yet abandoning it was unthinkable. The palace had become inseparable from the legitimacy of the monarchy. This is the critical turning point. Systems built to dominate eventually demand more energy to sustain than they return in stability. The cost of maintaining power begins to exceed the cost of challenging it. Versailles did not collapse at this stage, but it stopped adapting, and in economic systems, rigidity is often the first sign of failure. If you're still following this analysis closely, this channel was built for viewers like you. At what point do you think maintaining power becomes economically unsustainable? The breakdown of the Versailles system did not occur because it suddenly became too extravagant. It broke down because the economic environment that once made it effective no longer existed. The palace had been designed for a world in which wealth was slow-moving, elites were geographically fixed, and authority flowed downward through visible hierarchy. By the late 18th century, that world was gone. What replaced it was faster, more volatile, and far less forgiving. The first fault line appeared in the form of debt. The French state had long relied on borrowing to bridge the gap between revenue and expenditure, and Versailles played an indirect role in normalizing that dependence. Court spending was politically untouchable, even as military costs rose and administrative obligations expanded. Borrowing was no longer a temporary measure. It became structural. As debt grew, so did sensitivity to confidence. Creditors began to care less about spectacle and more about solvency. The appearance of wealth, once a strategic advantage, lost its persuasive power. Financiers wanted reform, transparency, and reliable repayment mechanisms. Versailles could offer none of these. At the same time, the court's internal logic stopped producing loyalty at scale. Too many nobles competed for too few rewards. Offices multiplied, but their value diluted. Pensions lost purchasing power. Favor became unpredictable. The system still consumed wealth, but it no longer guaranteed stability in return. This created a dangerous inversion. What had once neutralized elite power now generated elite resentment. Courtiers burdened by debt and declining influence began to question the value of participation. Absenteeism increased. Regional interests reasserted themselves. The gravitational pull of Versailles weakened. Outside the palace, economic pressure intensified. Poor harvests, rising food prices, and regressive taxation placed strain on populations that had long subsidized the system indirectly. Unlike nobles, these groups received no compensating access or prestige. Their tolerance depended on the belief that the system was necessary. As fiscal crises mounted, that belief eroded. Attempts at reform exposed the depth of the problem. Any serious effort to stabilize state finances required changes to taxation, privilege, and spending. Yet Versailles embodied the very privileges that needed to be dismantled. Reform threatened the court's reason for existing. In this sense, the palace had become incompatible with survival. This is where early signs of collapse become visible, not as chaos, but as paralysis. Decision-making slowed. Compromises failed. Temporary fixes replaced structural solutions. Each delay increased the cost of resolution. The system had reached a point where maintaining appearances was more expensive than addressing reality, yet abandoning appearances felt more dangerous than insolvency. This is the classic end stage of a mature power structure. It does not fall because it is attacked. It falls because it cannot move. When broader political upheaval finally arrived, Versailles was not its cause. It was its amplifier. The palace concentrated resentment as effectively as it had once concentrated wealth. What had been a financial weapon turned into a symbol of misallocation. In economic terms, the model stopped working because it could no longer convert expenditure into control. Money still flowed in, but loyalty no longer flowed out. Once that exchange broke down, the system lost its purpose. Thoughtful discussions often add new layers to this kind of analysis. Feel free to share your perspective. Do you believe this breakdown was inevitable, or could different decisions have changed the outcome? Today, Versailles no longer functions as a center of political or economic control. It is a museum, a historical site, and a destination for millions of visitors each year. Yet despite this transformation, the economic logic that once animated it has not disappeared. It has changed form. What remains of the original system is not authority, but pattern. Versailles now generates revenue through tourism, cultural branding, and state-supported preservation. This revenue is transparent, measurable, and finite. But its deeper function lies elsewhere. It operates as a symbolic asset, one that continues to shape how power, wealth, and legitimacy are imagined long after its operational role has ended. The palace still teaches a lesson about how centralized systems work. Visitors are not simply observing art and architecture. They are moving through a space designed to choreograph attention, hierarchy, and awe. The geometry, scale, and procession routes still guide behavior, even without a king present. This is the modern echo of Versailles as a financial weapon. The weapon has been disarmed, but its design principles remain visible. Around the world, similar structures exist. Capitals built to centralize elites. Corporate campuses designed to absorb talent and loyalty. Cultural institutions that convert prestige into influence. These places do not always extract wealth directly, but they redirect it, shaping where people spend time, money, and ambition. The key continuity is concentration. Versailles demonstrated that concentrating elites in a single space can be more effective than coercion. Modern systems replicate this logic digitally, administratively, and spatially. Physical presence has been partially replaced by network access, but the underlying economics are familiar. What has changed is speed. Capital moves faster. Information flows instantly. No modern system can rely on ritual alone for control. Yet symbolism still matters. Anchors still matter. Systems still require places, whether physical or virtual, where legitimacy feels tangible. Versailles endures because it captures this truth in stone. It reminds us that power is rarely exercised, only through force or law. It is exercised through environments that shape behavior subtly, persistently, and at scale. If you're interested in more modern parallels like this, subscribing helps you. Stay connected. What current place do you think future historians will analyze through this same economic lens? When the story of Versailles is told as a tale of excess, it feels moral and complete. A palace too large, too costly, too detached from reality, eventually undone by its own extravagance. But that version of the story is comfortable precisely because it avoids the harder truth. Versailles did not fail because it was irrational. It failed because it was rational for too long. It was built to solve a specific economic problem in a specific historical moment. How to neutralize independent wealth without open conflict, how to centralize power without confiscation, and how to turn surplus into dependence. For decades, it succeeded. It reorganized incentives, redirected capital, and reshaped elite behavior with remarkable efficiency. The lesson is not that spectacle is dangerous. The lesson is that systems designed to manage power through economic design eventually inherit the limits of their own logic. What begins as a solution becomes an obligation. What begins as control becomes cost. And what begins as stability becomes rigidity. Versailles reminds us that money and power are never separate. They move together, reinforce each other, and decline together. Architecture, ceremony, and culture are not decorations layered on top of economics. They are instruments through which economics operates. This is why the story of Versailles still matters. Not because monarchy returned, but because the pattern did. Modern systems continue to build environments that absorb ambition, redirect resources, and convert participation into dependence. The materials have changed. The scale has changed. The logic has not. When we strip famous places down to their economic core, we stop asking whether they were beautiful or excessive and start asking what problems they were built to solve, whose money they reorganized, and what costs they deferred into the future. Versailles was not a mistake. It was a design, and like all powerful designs, it worked until the world around it changed faster than the system itself could adapt. If this analysis changed how you see famous places, you may want to stay with this channel for future breakdowns. What place would you want to see examined next once the story is stripped down to its economic core?